This is Judges 7. The Midianites have been ravaging Israel for 7 years, but Yahweh is on the move. He appeared to Gideon, declared himself to be with Gideon, pronounced Gideon to be a mighty man of valor, and commissioned Gideon to strike the Midianites as one man. In other words, he wants Gideon to be confident enough that Yahweh could do it with just him only if need be. Gideon sent out messengers to at least 4 tribes. Yahweh moved in some of the men to answer the call, and they've gathered themselves around Gideon. After Yahweh disappeared from Gideon, he proved he was still there by allowing himself to be tested with Gideon's fleece. Yahweh told Moses, "You shall not test the Lord your God," Deuteronomy 6:16, but that was in the context of testing God in a belligerent and unbelieving way. Yahweh allowed himself to be tested in the case of Gideon's fleece, but even Gideon knew he was treading on thin ice because he said before he did it, quote, "Do not let your anger burn against me." So in general, it's risky to test God, but Yahweh allowed it, and now, verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, who is Gideon, and all the people who were with him, rose up early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. Midian's camp was on the north side of them, by the hill of Moreh in the valley. Comment: the Midianites and Amalekites are camped in the valley of Jezreel, according to the last chapter. We can identify that valley with precision, but the specific locations in and around the valley mentioned here aren't so well identified. However, we can deduce that the Midianites' camp at the hill of Moreh must be within about 5 miles of Gideon's camp, which is by the spring of Harod, because in a moment Gideon will be able to walk to the Midianite camp, back to his camp, then back to the other camp again, all in one night before the night's half over. So in other words, Gideon is camped within striking distance of the Midianites. Now in Gideon's camp, Yahweh will speak to Gideon. Verse 2. Yahweh said to Gideon, "The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel brag against me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.'" Comment: there are some troop numbers coming up. If we do the math, we know that Gideon has 32,000 with him right now. Yahweh says 32,000 is too many. Yahweh doesn't want any bragging about the strength of men. He wants Israel to know that this deliverance will come from Yahweh. Verse 3. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, "Whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead." So 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. Comment: Mount Gilead is also obscure, but it must be another name for Gideon's location. Yahweh told Gideon to tell the fearful and trembling to go home. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, Hebrews 11:16. So if we're afraid, we might as well go home. Let's make up our minds to be courageous in God. We want to be among those who make the cut. This command of Yahweh to Gideon is in harmony with Yahweh's command to Moses in Deuteronomy 20, verse 8. When Israel draws near to battle, the officers should speak to the troops and say, quote, "Is there any man who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go back to his house, lest he make the heart of his fellows melt like his own." End quote. So let's not discourage someone who has taken up a project in faith. The culling of the fearful thinned the army down by more than 2/3. 22,000 departed. The 10,000 who remained were by their own judgment not afraid. Verse 4. Yahweh said to Gideon, "There are still too many people. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. It shall be that those whom I tell you, this shall go with you, the same shall go with you, and whoever I tell you, this shall not go with you, the same shall not go." So he brought down the people to the water, and Yahweh said to Gideon, "Everyone who laps of the water with his tongue like a dog laps, you shall set him by himself, likewise everyone who bows down on his knees to drink." The number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people bowed down on their knees to drink water. Yahweh said to Gideon, "I will save you by the 300 men who lapped, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, each to his own place." Comment: we can read that very carefully and still not be exactly sure what Yahweh was saying about the drinking. Bottom line, another 9,700 are going home. There are only 300 men left out of 32,000. Verse 8. So the people took food in their hand and their trumpets, and he sent all the men of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was beneath him in the valley. Comment, the men who were going home left ram's horns and provisions with the men who were staying. Verse 9. That same night Yahweh said to him, Arise, go down into the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down, go with Purah your servant down to the camp. You will hear what they say, and afterward your hands will be strengthened to go down into the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outermost part of the armed men who were in the camp. Comment, God gave Gideon a choice. He could attack right away, or if he was afraid, he could scout the situation first. He must have been afraid because he scouted. Yahweh said that would settle his nerves. Yahweh called Gideon a mighty man of valor in the last chapter, but Gideon's not feeling it. He might have been one of the 22,000 fearful men to go home on the first cut if he didn't know better. Now coming up, the details of the scouting mission. Verse 12. The Midianites and the Amalekites and all the children of the east lay along in the valley like locusts for multitude, and their camels were without number, as the sand which is on the seashore for multitude. Comment, coming up, Gideon and his servant have sneaked up into this massive camp in the dark so they can overhear two of them talking. Verse 13. When Gideon had come, behold, there was a man telling a dream to his fellow. He said, Behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent, and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. His fellow answered, This is nothing other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has delivered Midian into his hand with all the army. It was so when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation that he worshipped. Comment, it's hard to gather 32,000 men in secret, and the gathering has indeed leaked to the Midianites, but Yahweh's working it to Gideon's advantage. He's planting the fear of Gideon and God in them. Gideon worshipped. He's feeling it now. It's still dark and going on in verse 15. Then he returned into the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for Yahweh has delivered the army of Midian into your hand. He divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put into the hands of all of them trumpets and empty pitchers with torches within the pitchers. He said to them, Watch me and do likewise. Behold, when I come to the outermost part of the camp, it shall be that, as I do, so you shall do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp, and shout, For Yahweh and for Gideon. Comment, each man has a ram's horn and a torch, but the torches are hidden inside clay vessels. Verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outermost part of the camp in the beginning of the middle watch, when they had but newly set the watch. Comment, the night is not yet half over, still in verse 19. Then they blew the trumpets and broke in pieces the pitchers that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets, broke the pitchers, and held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands with which to blow. And they shouted, The sword of Yahweh and of Gideon. They each stood in his place around the camp. Comment, the 3 groups of 100 have surrounded the Midianites. They blew their trumpets, smashed their pitchers, and revealed their torches. It looks and sounds like an attack, even though the Israelites are just standing in their places. Still in verse 21. And all the army ran, and they shouted and put them to flight. They blew the 300 trumpets, and Yahweh set every man's sword against his fellow and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Bethshittah toward Zererah, and as far as the border of Abel-Meholah by Tabbath. Comment, Yahweh set every sword against his fellow, meaning the Midianites and Amalekites were fighting each other in the dark. Now switching focus to something that must have happened over the next day or two, verse 23. The men of Israel were gathered together out of Naphtali and out of Asher and out of all Manasseh and pursued Midian. Comment, tribes adjacent to the valley are joining the 300 in pursuit. Verse 24. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, Come down against Midian and take the waters before them as far as Beth-barah, even the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were gathered together and took the waters as far as Beth-barah, even the Jordan. Comment, Gideon sent runners to Ephraim, which is far south of the battle, because the fords of the Jordan are at Ephraim, Judges 12:5. He wants Ephraim to cut off the escape route, verse 25. They took the two princes of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at Oreb's rock, and Zeb they killed at Zeb's winepress, and pursued Midian. Then they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon beyond the Jordan. Comment: Oreb and Zeb are princes of Midian, which could also be translated generals or rulers or leaders. One died near a certain rock, and one died near a certain winepress. Thereafter the rock and winepress became known by their names and served as testaments to the battle. That's the chapter, but in the last verse, Gideon has crossed the Jordan, and he'll keep pursuing in the next chapter. Judges 8 is next at landofhavilah.net. Judges 8. This is the map of Judges 7. None of the locations in this chapter can be pinpointed with precision, but the Midianite camp was definitely in the valley of Jezreel. To be more specific, this is possibly the hill of Moreh around which they were camped. There's a spring here, quite possibly associated with the spring of Harod by which Gideon was camped. The area around that spring is now an Israeli national park associated with Gideon. It's about 5 miles or 4 miles from the suggested location of the Midianite camp. The spring to here is about 4 miles. The Midianites fled south and attempted to cross the Jordan at some fords near Ephraim. The Ephraimites were able to strike some of them, but others were able to get over the river, as we'll find out in the next chapter. Chapter 8 is next.